Today in the church in the United States of America, we celebrate Respect Life Sunday. And so I'd like to take this opportunity to talk about the dignity of human life from the moment of conception to natural death. As John Paul II said, we live in a culture of death, and it's important for us to grapple with these issues, to understand the church's teaching, and to be able to really defend the position of the church in the midst of a world that really often does not understand why the church teaches as she does. Now, before I begin this conversation about respect life and the sanctity of life in the womb, I want to make a comment about God's mercy. It is possible that there are people here who have experienced the tragic choice of abortion, and I want anyone in that situation to know that this is not in any way a judgment. There's no condemnation. In fact, I want to remind everyone, because all of us in some ways have been the victim of the culture of death, I want to remind you that God is mercy. God is love. There is no sin that is bigger than God's mercy. None. In fact, the saints have said that all of the sins of the entire world are like a drop of water thrown into the ocean, because God's mercy is infinite. We can even think more magnificently, the mercy of God is the sins of the whole humanity are like a single flake of dust thrown into the immensity of space. Compared to God's mercy, our sins are nothing. God can forgive and desires to forgive every sin. Nevertheless, it's important, I think, because this can be an uncomfortable conversation, it is important for me as your pastor to talk about this issue and for people to be able to understand and to defend the church's position. The culture of death, in talking about a child in the womb, will use 4 arguments in order to say that that child is not really a human person. And if the child in the womb is not a person, then therefore that life can be snuffed out. So I'd like to talk about that with you. In general, apologists in the area of pro-life will use the acronym SLED, S-L-E-D, in order to defend life. These are the 4 arguments that can be presented as part of the culture of death that we can respond to pretty easily. The arguments are based on SLED, size, the level of development of the fetus, the environment of the fetus, and the degree of dependency of the fetus in the womb. So let's talk about those issues. First of all, size. People who are pro-culture of death, who don't believe in the sanctity of life in the womb, will say, well, you know, the baby is too small. It's not really a human person because it's so tiny. So they're basing our argument on human nature, that it is only a human at a particular size. But if you think about that for a minute, it doesn't really make sense, does it? I mean, to say like size determines our human dignity. If the bigger you are, the more human dignity you have, then we have to then start making comparisons. Well then, you know, a little kid who only weighs 60 pounds has not the same amount of dignity as a person who is, you know, orca huge, right, who is 700 pounds lying in bed. That 700-pound person has way more human dignity because they're so immense and large. Clearly that's not true. Our human dignity is not based on size. Therefore, this argument that a child in the womb is so small and therefore is not human is erroneous. Our dignity is not based on the size of the person. Even if a child is only an inch long, it is a person, not based on size. The next argument that is presented is the argument of the level of development. The level of development. In the womb, the fetus has not developed sufficiently in order to manifest human characteristics. Well, that becomes a slippery slope also, because at what point do they have sufficient development in order to call them a human. Maybe we could step it back a little bit and say, well, until you reach puberty, you're not a human person. Well, of course, that becomes crazy. Or, the fullness of the human development with understanding and logic and capacity as around 50 years old. Well, clearly that's not true either. If you look at a small child, an infant that's just been born for 3 days, they clearly don't have the human development of a toddler or a 40-year-old. So the dignity of the person is not based on the level of their development. In fact, if we look at it really honestly, the moment a person is conceived in the womb, their full genetic structure is already determined. Isn't that fascinating? The moment of conception, their genetic code is permanently fixed. The color of their eyes, the color of their skin, the color of their hair, everything is already determined. And when people say, well, that little 2-cell organism doesn't look like a human, my response is, yes, it does. It looks exactly like a human at that stage of development. Just like a little baby does not look like a 40-year-old, right? But a little baby looks exactly like a human at that phase of development. A toddler at that phase of development. A 50-year-old at that phase of development. And the little child in the womb looks exactly like a human person because they are a human person at that phase of development. Their genetic structure is already totally, perfectly, and completely determined. The next argument that is presented to us sometimes is the argument of environment. Because the baby is in the womb, some people say it's not a human person until it exits the womb. If you think about that for a moment, it means that the dignity of the human person is determined by location. Depending on where you are determines whether or not you're human. And obviously we can see that that's a ridiculous argument. Does that mean that if you live in Africa, you're more of a human than if you live in Asia or some other place on the world? Our humanity is not dependent on where we are. Location doesn't determine our humanity. And that includes if the baby is in the womb. Location doesn't determine the humanity. The fact that it is a human, it is a person, is independent of where the person may be located at an accidental moment in time. Finally, there's the argument of the degree of dependency. People say, well, that baby is totally dependent on that woman, on her womb, on her. Therefore, because the baby is totally dependent on that woman, she has the right to not complete the pregnancy. So this argument is an argument based on the child's dependency on someone else. Once again, we see how silly, how specious that argument is. To say that a person's human dignity is determined by how dependent they are on someone else. I mean, let's be honest, a child of 3 days is totally and completely dependent on someone else. A toddler will not survive without their parents. Many people are dependent on others in order to survive for their life. I mean, I wouldn't have enough food to eat if I was the one who had to cook and shoot or kind of find all my food. I am dependent. All of us are dependent on one another, really, to live. And as we advance in age, we'll find that we become more and more dependent as we perhaps become more frail and in need of the assistance of others. Our humanity is not determined by the level of dependency that we have on another person. Therefore, to say that a child in the womb, because it's dependent on its mother, is therefore not a human, is a ridiculous argument. The arguments that are presented before us of size, level of development, environment, and degree of dependency in order to determine the value of a person are faulty. They're ridiculous. The church and sacred scripture teaches us that every single person is the beautiful image of God in the world. Each of you is the presence of God manifest in beauty in the world. And that beauty begins at the moment of conception through natural death. Every person is the created image of God. And so on this Respect Life Sunday, we as Catholic Christians want to know the truth about human life, the dignity of every person, and fight for the protection of human life. I would say we do that in two ways. One, by our life of prayer. We want to pray that all people will recognize the dignity of the human person from the moment of conception to natural death. But we also have to work to promote the dignity of the human person by our conversations with others, by understanding the issues and being able to talk about them with intelligence, and also in our political life. Now, as Catholics, we are not Republican or Democrat, right? Being a Catholic is much, much bigger than that, because there are issues that are Republican that we don't like, issues Democrat that we don't like, and that we do like in both sides of the arena, right? As a Catholic, we are much more than simply a political party. However, as Catholics voting, we have to take very seriously the importance of voting for candidates who believe in the sanctity of human life. I know sometimes people say to me, oh, well, you're just a one-issue voter. And to which I will respond, well, thank you for that. I appreciate that you have recognized that I really believe that this issue of life is the preeminent, paramount issue in the political real world at all time. And this is the reason why I would say that. This is my own logic in this. This is my own personal thinking in this area. Now, no political figure has the whole thing correct. There is no political figure out there in the world that clearly embraces every Catholic tenet of political life. But I think this way. If a person cannot see the most obvious truth that a child in the womb is really a human person, what else are they going to get wrong? I think about it in the terms of mathematics. If I can give you this example. Think if I were to say to someone, okay, if they cannot realize that 1 plus 1 equals 2, that's too hard for them. They don't have the mathematical skills to figure that out. How are you going to present that person with a complicated mathematical equation in which they have to arrive at the answer for X? They can't do it. It's impossible. I feel the same way in the issue of life. If a person can't see that obvious truth that a baby is a human person, I wonder if they would have the reasoning in order to achieve other answers in more complicated and difficult human situations. In the end, my brothers and sisters, we as Catholic Christians are called to thank God for the gift of life, to celebrate human life, to promote the dignity of every single person. We believe that we are sons and daughters of God. And as sons and daughters of God, we promote the dignity of human life, manifesting by all we say and do the truth that life is sacred from the moment of conception to natural death.
Amen.